We can start.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the webinar Moon, Religion and Ritual, produced by the Cultural Considerations Working Group of the Moon Village Association. I am Remo Rapetti, co-chair of this working group. Since the dawn of time, the moon has attracted the devoted attention of Earth's inhabitants. It has been attributed divine powers, magical abilities, and significant influences on our daily lives, from bottling wine to sowing seeds to cutting hair. With this webinar, we intend to explore how primitive beliefs led to the moon being seen as the first step toward the conquest of space. Nearly every civilization in the past imagined the moon as a deity, sometimes male, more often female. In Europe, these were mostly good deities, although the Greek Hecate presided over death, while in South America, human sacrifices were often made to the moon. To discuss the moon's significance for humanity throughout the ages and the future destiny of our satellite, we have invited two expert scholars, Caroline Kennett, British archaeoastronomer, astronomer, and author, and Dr. Dina Weibel of Grand Valley State University in Michigan. Following the presentations, Lisa Pettibone, renowned artist and co-chair of this working group, will lead a Q&A session where attendees can ask questions via the chat button. And now, let's go to the presentations. Caroline Kennett will start with a speech on moonlit monuments. As I said, she is an archaeoastronomer, astronomer, and author. She serves as the chair of the Society for the History of Astronomy and is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. Her research and writing explore topics ranging from planetary science to Cornish prehistory. Caroline has appeared on BBC Sky at Night and is a regular contributor to regional television and radio programs. She has presented her work at conferences around the world. Okay, Caroline, the floor is yours. Please start.
Thank you ever so much, and thank you for the invite to share some of my research. I'm going to just share my screen and we'll take it from there. Okay, is everyone happy? Thumbs up? Yeah. Okay, good. I'm based in the southwest of the UK, and we have a large amount of prehistoric monuments and remains which date from the late Neolithic into the Bronze Age within our landscape. It's predominantly a granite landscape, so the rock is incredibly hard, grey granite, but we also get some quartz, and within that there's rich metal and clay deposits, which people utilised and probably developed the increasing population which happened during the Bronze Age within our location in the UK. I'm going to talk today a bit about how the moon may have been a consideration, particularly moonlight, within the designs of these monuments. And when I started this research, I wanted to really consider how moonlight, what it was and how it played into the experiences that people may have had at these sites, not just the builders, but experiences which have continued through the ages. So one of the first things I wanted to do is define what moonlight is, and that's quite a tricky thing to do. There is a quantifiable definition, but there's also the wonder of what moonlight is. I did find this quote from this astronomer, and they say, "In our day when we live so much by artificial illumination, we seldom revel in the transformational scenes which take place under the magic spell of moonlight. The mysterious glamour which it casts over the scene, concealing harsh outlines, crude in the glare of sunlight." And then they continue, "One longs for the evening and the hour of sunset, when it is time of full moon, the queen of night who will weave her magic spell by illuminating the scene with her light." Perhaps surprising, this person was talking about artificial illumination and the degradation of moonlight, the loss of moonlight. And this was written by an astronomer, Mary Proctor, who was a British American astronomer nearly 100 years ago. And she was writing in the New Mexico region about following the Santa Fe Trail and the illumination of that area and the loss of moonlight. So I had a consideration at that point. If I was going to explore these sites and think about moonlight at these sites, I had to understand that that moonlight would have changed, and the levels of moonlight would have changed since prehistory due to artificial illumination. So that was one consideration that I had. So what makes moonlight? Well, it's reflected light from the sun, and I'm going to go quickly through these slides because I want to get on more about the things that I was doing. But we have the phases of the moon, which we go from new moon to full moon, back to new moon. And it's at full moon where we would anticipate and expect the most amount of moonlight. What's interesting though, at full moon, when we get 100% moonlight, at half moon, we don't get 50% moonlight. We only get 8% of the brightness of the moon at half moon, and illumination drops rapidly down to new moon. So it's really moonlight is something which would have been probably utilized the most at on sites under full moon. We've just entered a year called the Major Lunar Standstill Year, and although this is quite a complex motion of the moon where it rises and sets, this is what people would have been tracking on the horizon during prehistory. We have sites where the moon rises and sets very low to the south, because we're in the northern hemisphere, and sites where it will rise and set very far to the north. And these move through a cycle which has been extending throughout this year. Now, to reach a moon rising very far to the north and it be full moon, we would have to be within the winter months. So it's the full moon nearest the winter solstice. During last winter, the one around last winter solstice and this winter solstice, you will see that full moon rise and set very far to the north and elevate incredibly high in the sky, casting an incredible amount of moonlight onto the ground. In opposite, the full moon nearest the summer solstice will arch very low against the horizon, and I'm going to show you a site in a moment where that might have been a consideration, and particularly with the way that moonlight has interacted with different elements of the landscape, different colours. So not all of these standstills are the same, and the full moon is only part of it, but we would get a standstill far north and far south rise and set points, but at different phases of the moon. But I wanted to focus into those full moons due to the amount of light the full moon was creating. This is a stone circle site on Bodmin Moor, and here I was visiting during the month of August 24, and I wanted to watch the moon almost near its southern rise and set, so it's almost full. and watch what happened during that evening as it rose and set along the southern horizon. I identified this site because in the past, antiquarian archaeologists and antiquarian astronomers had planned this site and had felt there was a connection with the moon. It's a stone circle within a henge, so you can see the stones there are the black markers, and then there's a henge with these bulges, these semicircular bulges, and they felt that that meant that it had something to do with the moon. I'm not going to go too much into detail of the setup of the site, but Audrey Burl was one of the people that felt that the moon at its most northern rise would align between the central stone and that northeast bulge in the top corner. This is the central stone. It's lying flat back in 1905 during an excavation, and they felt that that would have been standing at the time when the builders built the stone circles. So this is the evening that I was there, and the nearly full moon rose to the south, and it elevated quite low in the sky. So we didn't see it elevate any further up in the sky than 11 degrees. The moonlight itself was quite diffuse, and over the course of a number of hours, it kind of traveled quite horizontally, which was quite surprising in the sky, before starting to move over a set of hills in the very southwest. These hills are known as the St. Austell Hill Range, and what's interesting about this hill range is, although it's had a lot of industrialization and heavy manipulated over time for the extraction of china clay, that has enabled archaeologists to get into that area and have a look at some of the remains there. And what's they've been keen to excavate on those hilltops are a range of barrows or burial mounds. These burial mounds are heavily covered in yellow or orangey coloured clay. And this is a photograph from one of those excavations. This is the Watch Hill Barrow. And you can see just from the colour of this old photograph how vibrant this barrow would have appeared. And I did wonder then at that stage, if people were watching this low moon travel across this range of hilltops back in prehistory, had they covered these barrows in such a bright colour for moonlight to reflect on them and to illuminate them up in a different way. Here is a plan of where those barrows would fall, and the red areas there are the elevated areas that would have been hit by the moon shadows as it moved across these barrow tops. So why yellow? Why not another colour? Well, our eyes are, they are very clever. As we move from daylight into night, our eyes move from the rods to the cones, and we move from seeing very sharp and very colourful detail into a more monochrome setting. But this happens gradually during as the light dims. And yellow is one of the last colours that we see, hence why the choice of yellow is used for emergency vehicles, school buses, and things like that. And if you go out and you would watch the twilight happen, you will see that yellow would be one of the last colours that will ping out against the dying light before we go completely monochrome. So it's possible that they were choosing this yellow clay to be seen under low light conditions. Another experiment was undertaken with another site which has a lot of yellow clay. So this is a triple stone circle site. And at this triple stone circle site, we uncovered what's been called a pavement. And here it is. The pavement actually falls between two of the stone circles. And within the pavement, there's a lot of quartz stones and different stones of different materials of different colours, but they've all been packed into a base of yellow clay. So what we did, because we couldn't do the experiment while the excavation was happening, was we got a length of yellow cloth. And then we took that out under a moonlit sky, and we laid our yellow cloth out and took a drone up. And as the full moon rose, we started to photograph the yellow cloth in the landscape until we couldn't see it anymore. And that's some of the final dying moments of the yellow cloth being visible. And we timed that. It was just an effort to recreate whether the colour yellow itself could have been a key factor for them choosing yellow clay at sites. There are a lot of sites in Cornwall where yellow clay has been used, and we think it has been probably used to be used under low light conditions or full moon conditions. There we go. So it's likely, we think, that the yellow clay was used in these monuments to time celebrations at the full moon. And in this standstill year, where that moon is elevating either really high in the north and high in the sky, creating a lot of light, or low and within the areas of the sky where the yellow would be more pronounced, it's probably been chosen for those reasons. But we did start to think about other interactions at some of these sites, and one of these interactions included ideas of different colours. So I said about the reduction of colour as we start to get into different light, but white is one of these colours which obviously is more dominant during the night time. And we did get quartz stones at sites, but we started to think about whether white could have been used in different ways. So this was an experiment again with the yellow cloth, a brownish coloured cloth and a white cloth under moonlight. And there it is a little bit later. You can just see the yellow cloth. The whiter cloths are still far more visible under that full moonlight. So we went out with the white cloth and decided to look at dressing stones with white cloth and what that would do under different moonlight. And there's a preparation, which I quite liked the whole story around the preparation. There was the time that it took to take the cloth and stitch the cloth, choose the stone. You could see that people might have individual stones that they might have chosen, or it might be being a family stone. And then they've lovingly taken maybe some cloth or another item to cover the stone with in preparation for a moonlit ritual. You could uncover the stone itself and go into the cloth under the moon and see the visibility of that. And then we experimented at getting in and out the cloth, different people, becoming part of the line of stones, seeing what it was like to feel part of a monument, as well as being, so it was more that interaction with the monument under different lighting conditions as well. But I hope that's a very quick kind of condensed thing of what we've been up to in Cornwall around moonlight and our ancient sites, and hopefully you can take away some different ideas. That's my moon shadow there, but I will stop my share. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. It was a very charming topic and also a beautiful presentation. Thank you. And now, Dina Wible will talk about the once distant moon from a sacred light to a human domain. Dr. Dina Wible is professor of anthropology at Grand Valley State University, jointly appointed in religious studies program in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies. Her research focuses on the intersections of religion, science, and space exploration, including how astronauts' subjective experiences in space are used in spirituality and meaning-making. She is the author of The Ultra View Effect, what we can learn from astronauts about awe, humility, and exploring the unknown, due to be published in May 2026 by the University of California Press. Dina, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Remo. Let me go ahead and get my PowerPoint going here. I better share first. I guess that's the right order to do that. Okay, share PowerPoint. All right, thank you. So this is a combination of different approaches to study, some of this coming from history, some of this coming from anthropological research. But I'm kind of exploring in this talk the idea of the moon as an object changing over time and how religion sort of has tied in with that. And so I think it naturally follows from some of what Carolyn has been talking about too. Okay, now I've got to figure out how to get to the next slide. This sometimes happens. Okay, so some of this has been reviewed both by Carolyn and Remo, but the moon has had a religious role throughout history, probably prehistory. We know that the moon has served as a deity. It still does in a lot of places. It also, especially in religions that we can mention like Judaism and Islam, serves as a clock, a way of, paying attention to the time of year, to the seasonality, the beginning of festivals, the end of festivals. And if anything else, it provides a light in the darkness, at least during some times of the year. In addition, we have a strong physical component that links life on Earth with the moon. It regulates the tides, as we know. It's not the only thing that does that, but it's definitely part of it. It seems to be connected to fertility, especially notions of the female cycle being connected to the moon. And of course, rituals are timed with the moon. And we can see it as something that the life on our planet evolved with the moon as this satellite that has an effect on things like gravity and light. And so we can consider ourselves as a species, one of many on Earth, that connected to the moon in terms of our biological evolution. And so we do know that lunar light shapes animal behavior. Owl monkeys pictured here and tarsiers respond to different phases of the moon. And sea creatures obviously have a relationship with the tides. This coral that I'm showing here responds to phases of the moon, and they release their eggs for reproduction only during full moons, which is kind of interesting. And so that idea that there's this rhythm between life on Earth and the moon that goes beyond just the cultural, but is also something that's biological and seems to be innate in the bodies of entities that live on this planet. One of the things that we see in recent human history is the idea of the moon being an object, a light in space or in the firmament, and that shifting over the last several centuries to the idea of the moon being a physical place that people can imagine themselves stepping on, walking on, living on. So part of this transition came through Galileo. He was able to sort of revise and improve the telescope. By 1609, 1610, he was getting a very good look at the moon. This is one of Galileo Galilei's sketches of the moon. And after that happened, there has been a period of time where the moon was mapped by people on Earth and different parts of the moon were named. So you have, the Sea of Tranquility, you have different ridges, you have different mountains, and it starts to be seen as a place with a geography very similar to what we would see on Earth. And I'm not going to go into this very much, but anthropologist Lisa Messeri has a really good book that talks about how the moon and other parts of our solar system and universe have gone from being objects into places, and how people in the planetary sciences stopped seeing them as moving objects and started imagining them as places where humans could see themselves walking and moving around and having interactions, exploring. The moon, historically, for almost the entirety of human history, has been untouchable. It is a glowing light in the sky that can be predicted. It can regulate what happens with a human ritual, but it wasn't something that could physically be touched. In fact, the moon kind of stands symbolically in a lot of cultures for something beautiful that you can never reach. However, in the 20th century, the first soft landing on the moon, by which I mean the spacecraft didn't crash into the moon but landed gently, was Luna 9, sent by the Soviet Union in 1966. And then, of course, the first human contact with the moon was through Apollo 11. Apollo 8 had orbited the moon before, the crew there seeing the moon close up for the first time in human history with their own eyes. But it wasn't until Apollo 11 in 1969 that Buzz Aldrin and, of course, Neil Armstrong were the ones who walked on the moon for the first time. And there was a shift there, right? Somewhat controversially, the American astronauts planted the American flag on the moon, even though they said they came there for all of the world. And the moon sort of shifted into being territory rather than simply an object. So it was sort of, you can see it as an extension of what mapping the moon was. If we can map the moon and we can go to the moon, then the moon becomes physical territory that humans can inhabit. And that's a very strong shift in what the moon was and what the moon meant. As I mentioned before, there was an American flag planted on the moon, but there was an effort definitely to see the moon landing as a human achievement, something that could be shared nationally or internationally, I mean. There was concern about territorial claims. And so by the time we reached the very last lunar mission, Apollo 17 is a really good example. There was a collection of flags of roughly 135 nations, and those flags were taken to the surface of the moon, were there during the mission, then were returned to their countries of origin. And also those different countries were presented with moon rocks. And what I'm showing here in the picture is I've done ethnographic field work at the Vatican Observatory. This is the flag of Vatican City that was taken to the surface of the moon and then brought back. And that's on display in Vatican City. And the moon rocks that were returned to the Vatican are part of the meteorite, well, not there's a meteorite exhibition, a display, a laboratory, I guess is a better word for it, at the Vatican Observatory. And a couple of the brothers of the Jesuit group that work in the Vatican Observatory are meteoricists, and they have access to moon rocks. I believe some of them are from this Apollo 17 mission, but others were brought back, from other missions and then shared with scientific organizations. And so the idea of having the moon be something that was an international achievement, not just something associated with one country, was part of what the next step was. We're going through another shift, obviously. The moon was once seen as sacred, and now definitely through privatized space and also some national approaches to space exploration, it's being reframed as more of an industrial site. And so we're heading into a really interesting ethical quandary, because part of what has changed is the moon went from being universal. Every society knew about the moon. Every culture had some way of understanding the moon, but none of them could touch it, to something where only certain groups, only certain people with the capital to do so can access the moon. And so it is a universal sacred object that's being understood in new ways that might not treat it as a sacred object. So this is a new frontier. And one of the things that complicates this, that I'll talk about a little bit, is the treaties that were set up to protect the moon and to keep it sort of international assumed that nations would be the ones exploring the moon, not that individual entities or people or companies would be exploring the moon. So the legal landscape is kind of light on the ground. There's not a lot of legal precedent for what happens on the moon. And so it is a frontier in that way. We're in the Artemis era now, of course. There's a kind of new moon race with both China and the United States hoping to return human beings to the moon. But there are also private missions. I mentioned the laws were written for nations, not company. And there's also concern about the moon being a resource frontier. So some of the issues, there's the idea of helium-3 being possibly to acquire on the moon and different companies wanting to acquire that. There's also interest in the lunar poles as possibly being a source of ice that could be used to fuel rockets. And so the idea of the moon has become much less romantic and ethereal and much more treating it like an extension of Earth. Just a couple examples of issues that have arisen in terms of spirituality and ethics with the moon. A few years ago, the company Celestis had a mission that they had planned to undertake where they were working with a company called Astrobotics. And it wasn't NASA, it was a private company. And Astrobotics had the Peregrine lander that was going to do a moon landing. Celestis, as a company, allows people to purchase payload space on different rockets. And what people send is typically cremated remains of loved ones, usually between 1 ounce and 8 ounces of cremated remains. And the price for this service depends on how much you send. Also, people can have their DNA extracted through saliva and then pulverized and made into kind of an inert powder, and that can be sent up. And Celestis was working with Astrobotics to include a little bit over 100 canisters of human cremated remains and the remains of one dog to send them to the moon. And I've done ethnographic research with Celestis, going in their memorial services and talking to people who had loved ones they were sending, whose remains they were sending up. Typically, Celestis will either send ashes as part of a payload. And what's interesting is the canisters actually protect existing payloads. So Celestis is always sort of piggybacking on a mission that's already going. And the canisters of cremains or DNA are used as shielding for experiments on those rockets. In any case, sometimes they do suborbital flights where a rocket will go and return, and then the ashes are returned to the families, having been very briefly in space, kind of like a Blue Origin tourist flight. You also have rockets that are sent into Earth orbit and will eventually burn up as a result of that, but people can track them and see where the remains of, Grandpa are as they travel around. Some have been sent into deep space, including a lot of people involved in Star Trek. So Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, his wife Majel Barrett, and then several actors whose remains were sent into deep space. But this particular Peregrine lander was supposed to bring several of these cremated remains, like I said, over 100 people, onto the surface of the moon. And the Navajo Nation in the United States was very concerned about this because there are strong ideas about human remains being polluting and the moon itself being sacred, a goddess-like figure. And so they protested. There had been human remains sent to the moon previously, those of Eugene Shoemaker in the late 90s, and Celestis had actually done that at that time. But this particular mission really was seen as a betrayal because NASA had agreed not to do this without consulting the Navajo Nation. And even though this wasn't a NASA mission, it still was interpreted as a violation of that because there was some NASA cooperation. In any case, the Peregrine lander had a leak and it was not able to reach the moon. So those cremated remains didn't get to the moon, but it provides an interesting case study of people with the means and money to do something. This private company, Astrobotics, making a decision that doesn't take sort of the universal understanding of the moon into account. I also have up here a picture of the Cross on the Moon Coalition. This is something that is in the planning stages. There's an American sort of tech, we would call him a tech bro, a technical industrialist, but who's also involved in space policy, whose name is Justin Park. And he had a dream after his mother died that he needed to sort of bring Jesus to the world. And his decision was that he wants to bring 7.5-foot cross to the surface of the moon in some kind of lander, have it unfold from a rover of some kind. And he's currently trying to raise the $40 million it would take to do that. And one of the things he has said is that his goal is to consecrate the universe in the name of Jesus Christ. So here we have a notion of religion on the moon that once again is taking a page really out of, to be very literal, the conquistadors going to a new land and planting a cross to claim the land in the name of Christ. But it's happening on the moon, which is it's not necessarily happening, but there's an attempt to make it happen. So we'll see what happens with that. There is a long history of religious activity on the moon because we have humans on the moon. So the first meal ever eaten on the moon was Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, when the Eagle landed on the surface. He took a moment of silence and took communion. And these are images of the prayer that he brought with him, that he said to himself. He drank from this communion cup. The wine is in that little beaker that you see there. And then he had a consecrated host. He was not Catholic. He went to Webster Presbyterian, and his minister allowed him to bring all of that up. I've been to that church, and they have copies of that communion cup and the plaque everywhere, like so many copies of that almost in every case, on every desk. And it's a really interesting church because all of the stained glass is made to look like nebula. And so it's a very space-oriented church. Jim Irwin, who was part of Apollo 15, he was very religious, had what some have described as a conversion experience on the moon, and became very devout and spent a lot of the rest of his life trying to find Noah's Ark. He was on the moon with David Scott, who left a Bible, a red Bible, and you can see where the arrow is pointing here, on one of the lunar rovers. And it's very likely that places where humans land on the moon in the 20th and 21st centuries, if humans end up living on the moon, those might be ritual sites or memorial sites moving forward. On the other hand, we might imagine the moon losing its religious significance. There are efforts being made now to plan lunar factories, such as the one I have showing here on the top, that is trying to produce glass fibers. There's the potential for lunar mining. This comes out a lot. And this is actually for children. It's aimed for children starting at about age 6 to probably about age 12 to imagine mining the moon. And part of what we see in science fiction, especially dystopian science fiction, is this transition of the moon from a place of wonder to a place that's either terrible or very ordinary. And so I think this was around 2003, there was a version of The Time Machine, the H.G. Wells story, where there's mining and settling on the moon, and the moon actually breaks into pieces in the sky. And that's one kind of sort of horror that people can imagine from turning the moon into just a normal place of human occupation. Another one comes from the movie Ad Astra, and this one sort of makes me laugh. But this is supposed to be the surface of the moon during that story. And the arrow here is pointing to an Applebee's, which is a chain restaurant in the United States, with the idea that essentially there's a shopping mall on the moon, and the moon is no longer a place of wonder. That being said, if we do have human settlements or outposts on the moon, they will be able to look back at the Earth. There is some sense that ritual and spiritual activity will continue, but with the Earth perhaps as the focus. There is kind of likelihood with human settlements or outposts on the moon that the Earth and the moon will be seen as a unit with a shared destiny. But you can see we're moving from reverence from the moon to physical presence to this idea of present or possession or ownership. And it's possible for exploration to take place and awe to remain. But there's also the risk that religious ideas that could be positive or negative, such as the notion that humans are supposed to be stewards over God's domain, the earth, that can be extended to the moon as well. And I wanted to close with two images. One of them is in it's an archaeological site. It's Choqquechirre, which was an Incan temple dedicated to the moon. And the second one is concept art by artist Jorge Mañez Rubio, who is imagining a temple on the moon. So we have a temple of the moon followed by a temple on the moon. And with that, I'll stop. Fortunately, Carolyn mentioned her book. I will also mention my book. And thank you very much. I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Dina. Very interesting presentation. Okay, let's go to possible questions. Lisa, do you have any comment?
Yeah, maybe I'll just get us started. And do remember everybody that's listening can also put your questions in the chat, or is it possible for people just to speak out as well?
No, they have to write on
the chat. Okay, that's fine. Okay. Yeah, let me see. I was just looking at Caroline's presentation. One of the things that I was wondering about, was really fascinating listening to your story about the dressing of the stones in Cornwall. And I was just wondering, is there some evidence of rituals like this happening, say, in the last couple hundred years? Has that lived on, and what was the evidence that happened?
I don't think there's detailed evidence of people dressing stones. I think people have experimented with the idea of covering stones before. We went with the white to highlight the moonlight, but I know that other artists have explored that area in the 70s and 80s, more to do with the idea of folklore and the stones being humans turned to stone, the petrification of people into stone. So that normally led people down that route into looking at dressing stones and things. But there is some evidence on the continent that colours may have been used on stones, and certainly we also have passage graves which have a large amount of yellow clay lining the walls, which would have allowed decoration as well to be put onto that clay. Unfortunately, the main one, which had that yellow clay plastered on the inside, was excavated in the 1950s, and although the person wrote there was decoration, there is no evidence now of that remaining for anyone to investigate more.
Right. Okay. And is there any known rituals in moonlight that happened, at different times of the year when the moon was highest and lowest on the horizon?
I think, well, for us, when we're talking about prehistory, there's little to no written evidence. We have some very early written stuff, which was done by the first Greek travelers to Britain, and but early, we're talking about such a length of time and such different communities as well. When we throw out the words Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, these communities went for hundreds of years, and we don't have that evidence other than the monuments and the stones and the objects that they left behind, and we have to almost experiment with what's on the ground to try and pick out different ideas. So we can never really fully understand what those rituals might be. We can always have a go at looking at different ways that they may have interpreted site and place and sky. And for instance, we have a very early quoit, Hendra Burnett quoit, which had a lot of quartz deposits. and quartz itself is quite white, and they've used it as tools, and then they've snapped these deposits. So much in the way that they would have used flint, but they would have used these as cutting tools, and they've snapped these and they've deposited them on the ground quite liberally. Maybe in an effort to decommission the site, or for the site to be seen under different lighting conditions, again, maybe moonlight. But it's very difficult. We have to kind of play around with these ideas a little bit, and all the time we're thinking of ways of different interactions that we could have perhaps have, and it's more of a phenomenological based interpretation of sight rather than an actual historic evidence based, if you can get what I mean.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. One can imagine fertility rituals happening at certain times of the year, and these stones would become places where things like that could play out over hundreds of years.
Yeah, we can look at the anthropological records from different cultures and things like that, but you know, we don't really know how people engaged with the prehistory here in the UK on that level. Those rituals and things have been lost.
Yeah, we just have the evidence that they were watching the cycles of the moon, and they became important enough to put things in the landscape. So yeah, that's really interesting. Good. The other thing I was going to ask you, Dina, is I suppose perhaps it relates to your book on the overview effect. It had occurred to me while you were talking there that that will be something quite different for people residing on the moon to experience. That'll be a universal experience. And I'm wondering, has it been discussed that may change, or perhaps spawn new kinds of rituals and new connections to the earth as well by seeing the sort of two juxtaposed together like that?
Yeah, I think it definitely will. My book does touch on the overview effect. It really focuses on something I call the ultraview effect, which is less looking at Earth, but more looking outward.
Yeah.
But I definitely talk about the overview effect. And I do think that when we have more permanent settlements on the moon, we're going to find that looking at the Earth means different things to different people. So in some ways, it reminds me a little bit of Muslims who have made the pilgrimage to Mecca and then will face Mecca when they pray, remembering their time there. And I think the idea of this visual of where you no longer are, being homesick perhaps, but having your home like right there next to you.
Yeah.
With the astronauts, it was exciting, right? Because they were on a mission and they knew they were going to head home. But if you're talking about several months or even years, I think it's going to be a strong, there'll be a lot of longing associated with Earth.
Yeah.
That being said, it'll be interesting to see if we do have any long-term communities, whether the normal things that people use the moon for will shift. So for instance, I'm really speculating here, but if you had a Jewish community on the moon, would they plan rituals around where the moon was in relation to the Earth, or would it eventually be easier to do something where it was the opposite direction? And I wonder places like Mars where you have two moons. Do you stick with the Earth, or do you adjust to where you are? And religions are flexible. It'll be very interesting to see what stays the same and what changes.
Sure. And people will always take spirituality with them and have different kinds of spiritual experiences when they arrive on the moon or Mars or whatever. So they'll become integrated, I suppose, in their lives, and whatever, even very on a personal level or more organized level. Yeah.
I very much agree with that. I've talked to people who get personally irritated with me that I'm suggesting that space exploration is a realm where religion takes place. But I've talked to a lot of people who've been in space, and religion is a place, religion takes place in space. It absolutely does. So I do agree with you that because it seems to be part of what it means to be human, not every human, but culturally it's more the norm than not, that it will go with us into space if we go into space for sure.
I was also curious about some of the Navajo rituals or concepts about the moon, how Native Americans, why they see it as a sacred place. Can you give a little context to that, and how obviously it's in contrast to the way NASA sees the moon, or this more industrial view of the moon, but it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about the Navajo beliefs that are attached to it.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Native American religion, unfortunately. It's one of those things where you like localize and then you speak about generalities. If I were to speak about Native American beliefs in general, and what I do know about the Navajo, there is a tendency to see the moon as part of this dynamic sky. There are a lot of stories associated with constellations, stories associated with the moon. The moon itself being like constant and predictable, but also changing over time, seems to have very strong symbolic elements that mean that it represents continuity and giving and light. It has to do with the seasons and the idea of different moons being associated with different times of the year. In fact, one of the things that comes up is that calendar really, the moon associated with specific events is less about if you're counting like the third moon of the year or something, and what is actually happening in nature when the moon is full.
I see.
And so that idea of rhythm with nature and a connection with nature is very strong. But this idea of the dead being polluting is very strong in the Navajo community, where bodies are disposed of far away from, where people live, and you kind of want to keep that away. That's not unusual. I mean, I think most communities don't want the dead with them. But the idea of it being especially polluting is something we see. And that's one of the reasons why it hits that community so hard, to see a sacred entity like the moon becoming a place where you dispose of things that are really impure. And there's a recognition for sure in the NASA community. Or in the Navajo community, there are Navajo people who work for NASA. And there's a lot of complexity in that relationship. But the idea of doing something practical that's going to benefit humankind is one thing. The idea of intentionally choosing to send human remains to the moon is something else. And there's not a practical reason behind it. So it's harder to see that as something reasonable to accept.
Yeah, it's something that I think we need to pay more attention to in many ways, because parts of cultures need to be listened to. I don't know what can be done to make compromises, but the story should be out there about their beliefs. I think they consider it a place, or many of the nations respect the moon for places where their ancestors went as well, and that they have spiritual adventures on the moon, and they're very connected to it. And seeing these sort of spiky vehicles parked there, I think is really, it's quite disconcerting for them. So very interesting. Did you want to ask any questions, Remo?
There are two questions from the attendees.
Okay.
Birgit Bortoluzzi writes, which universal symbols or monuments of the moon could serve as the basis for new visual narratives? For example, for children who are learning to understand responsibility and protection in digital and cosmic space through stories and images? How can universal moon symbols be translated into visual modules that help children with long COVID experience protection, rhythm, and self-efficacy especially in times of exhaustion, isolation, and uncertainty. Anybody wants to answer?
I've been talking a lot, so I'll let Carolyn start.
Caroline?
I think that there's certainly some symbols which you can draw from prehistory. Those interpretations, as I say, there are interpretations of what the prehistoric people were drawing, and we don't know their actual intentions, but they're so beautiful. There is certainly some symbolism on Nauf, which is a prehistoric site in Ireland, where there are stones which encircle it. They have some symbolism which are, very similar to what we would interpret as astronomical symbols. And some of these are lunar based. So you can see that motion from new moon to full moon, back to new moon in some of these symbols. And there's an element of storytelling interpretation within that, which I think is really nice. It's not just that life is changing, but life is becoming full and then reducing back and then becoming full. It's this rotation through which follows a story and a pathway, which is as long as time itself. And I don't know if that's quite answering the question, but it's probably as close as I'm going to get with my experiences.
There was another question here. It says that this one is for you, Caroline. Why is it that the half illuminated moon is only 8% brighter than a full moon? And why is there a sharp peak in moonlight rather than a gentle increase over phases?
Okay, yeah, scientifically that's been measured, and you could see that exponential curve on the increase in moonlight. And I think once it gets to about a 75% full moon, that's where it tips into like generating that much more light at that point. I don't know if I've actually got the scientific reasoning behind that. I just know that that's been measured, and I found that quite interesting that at a 50% moon, it only creates 8% of the light of a 100% moon. I think one thing for me to take away, which I would take away from that as well, is that any impact from unnatural illumination also removes moonlight very rapidly. And as we lose our dark skies around the world, one of the first things to go is moonlight itself. And it's an interesting thing, moonlight, and one that people don't tend to experience or think about too much. You have to have incredibly dark skies, even with a full moon. And it's this kind of silvery blue light, which you can quite easily move around at under full moon, but only for about 3 days before and 3 days after. And that drop off in the curve under really true dark skies is incredibly noticeable. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you that scientific reasoning as to why it drops off so rapidly, but I know it does.
Yeah. Yeah, dark skies being becoming a rare thing will certainly affect moonlight as well, won't it? Yeah. Let's see, here's one from Glenn Swanson.
There is also a question for Dina. Isadora.
Yeah, I was just going to include somebody else's here because we'll,
okay.
Over time, we can maybe come back to it. So curious about the lighter stones, the limestone ? Used in Roman roads that could reflect moonlight. Can you comment on this, please? I don't know if anybody has any comment on that. The use of limestone or lighter stone on Roman roads that could reflect moonlight.
It certainly could have been an element of why they would have used that. If you were thinking of moving people over distances, you would probably use moonlight, particularly in the winter months when daylight is much shorter. So they're having moonlight on to white on the ground. It certainly makes it far easier. And you think maybe that's why chalk ridgeways were utilized a lot as well with the white chalk, and people could have been moving around and extending their daytime activity long into the night, particularly within those winter months when daylight was becoming at a premium. So yeah, it's a possibility. Yeah.
And quartz is present a lot of times around Neolithic sites, isn't it? So
Yeah,
it'd be
yeah,
very reflective and any time
Yeah.
of day. Yeah.
yeah.
So, okay, we've got one from Natalie Trevino. It says, thank you for the great presentations. My first question is for Caroline. Where is the yellow clay from? How did you come to know it would be possibly for ritual? And then another one for Dina. So I'll let you take that for now.
Okay, the yellow clay is sourced normally quite locally, although some of them, the sources can be up to a couple of miles away from where it's being utilized on the site. So the barrow, which I showed you, the Watch Hill Barrow, which has a huge amount of yellow clay, they were sourcing that from a riverbed about 1.5 miles further down the valley and bringing it up. Itself could have been seen as a ritual action of bringing that from the riverbed and then applying it to a burial mound. We think it would have been a ritual thing, though in a site on the Isles of Scilly where yellow clay has been used quite liberally on the inside of a chambered tomb. There was also what we would only, it's a loaded term, so I'm a little bit like, it's a libration stand, so kind of like an overly cup stand has been found made of yellow clay on the floor. So we think that they were utilizing it for things like that as well, and other yellow clay objects have been found within some of these places as well. But yeah, it's interesting where it appears on some sites. So although Watch Hill was completely covered with yellow clay, that as it was excavated back, there were elements of dark soil used and then another layer of yellow clay. So maybe it was applied over time with different timings of one group saying they didn't want the yellow clay, so they came and applied some soil, darker soil, and then another group reinstating the yellow clay. But on some other sites, it seems to have been applied round the base of the barrow and not on the top, or round an entrance way into the site. So they seem to have been very carefully considering the applications of the clay at times and at different sites.
Natalie's also asked a question of Dina. Have you worked with any pagan or earth-based religious communities that are resisting the commercialization of the moon? And in brackets, she says, also, I'm a GVSU alumnus.
Cool. Hey, Natalie. Yeah, I have worked with some of these communities. Actually, it was when I was doing research having to do with pilgrimage. So before I was really focused on space community or space studies, but there's definitely not just in the indigenous communities resistance to the moon being colonized or becoming a place of commercial interest, for sure in more of the earth-based religions that are common in the Western world, such as neo-paganism and Wicca. There's that resistance as well. There are some movements that see space exploration itself as problematic inherently. Others, the idea that it can be done, but it can be done in a responsible way, but that the people who are doing it right now are not necessarily the most responsible people. So I think there's a strong political element to it, and a fear that there's two ways to see this, and it's not just limited to earth-based religions or any religion in particular. One is if we go out into space and we start communities there, we're starting from scratch. It can be anything we want it to be. That is one view. The other view is that if we go into space, all we're going to be doing is taking the problems we have on this planet and transferring them out into space as well. And I think the second is probably more likely, but there's a lot of interest in somehow getting the first into place and using space exploration as a way to sort of start things over. And we've been talking about indigenous spirituality in the United States. There's a native author named Dawn Marsden, and she wrote an interesting book that somebody in the space community let me know about. It's called Starship Citizens, and she makes a really interesting argument that the way that indigenous people live is a really good analog for the way you would have to live in space, whether it's a colony on the moon or in a spaceship of some kind, a spacecraft. But the idea of an enclosed community, that you need to have certain level of harmony, a certain level of respect for everybody with you. You're not bringing new people in and new people out all the time, multi-generational. And so she goes through different steps in this book to kind of show how native life could be a model for life in space. And I think that kind of optimistic thinking and trying to bring something new into space is definitely a thread that I'll see in my
Great.
research.
So that's Dawn Marsden.
Marsden, Marsden. And unfortunately, I think the book is out of print, but I found it on Google Play after my friend recommended it to me. So I do have an electronic version of it.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds really interesting. Maybe we'll go, since you're with me here, Dina, we'll go back up to another question that Isadora Fontaine had, which was, what's your opinion on the moon as a tourist destination or even a tourist trap? Is it a possibility for the future?
I think so. We'd have to kind of go far into the future. So right now, obviously, getting humans on the moon is quite difficult. It's been 50 years since we've done that. But it could be happening very quickly. It could be next year. So we'll see what happens with it. Getting to a place where non-specialists would be able to go to the moon is like way farther ahead. So I think it would probably start out with people living and working on the moon, at least semi-permanently, then having friends and family occasionally visit. And then once it became something that was considered safe or predictable, or there was a efficient way to do it, then we probably would see people coming. I study tourism as well as pilgrimage, and so there's a lot to see. I think many people would want to see original landing sites or geographical features that have been, known well. There's a book called Artemis that was written by Andy Weir, who's known for The Martian and known for Project Hail Mary, both of which are excellent. Artemis has a lot focused on the moon being a tourist destination, and there are chances for people to go out and walk around on the Apollo 11 landing site, for instance. And I think a lot of what science fiction does now is kind of paving the way in an interesting way for future things. It's like science fiction is where we work through concepts and work through ethics and work through logistics before it actually happens. And there's such a strong tie between people in the space community and science fiction authors, and it just kind of goes in both directions.
Yeah. Good. Is there anything else? Here. I think Natalie had another, so there's I think it was about indigenous futurism, about connecting with new places. I'm not sure what that would mean, but
it ties into science fiction. So futurism is not always science fiction, but often is related to science fiction. But it can be art, it can be music. It's related to, like, people have heard mostly of Afrofuturism as a movement. Indigenous futurism is definitely something that's outside there too. I came across some of this when I was in Brazil a few years ago, where there is a non-Western non-explicitly Western way of understanding the future, of understanding space travel. And a lot of that is really interesting and really rich material that allows us to think about going into space from a completely different perspective. And I can't go into too many details about examples, but it's worth looking into for sure.
Yeah. We're hoping to do sci-fi and the moon by looking at science fiction writing about the moon, etc. So we're hoping to do that sometime early next year. So let's see. Remo, did you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't have any question. It was a very, very, very interesting webinar, I think. And this was also proved by the lot of questions that have been asked by our attendees. So I think that we can stop here. And I wish to thank our two speakers and Lisa for her wonderful job with the questions. And let's hope to have some more occasions to work together.
Great. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thanks again for your presentation. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.